Hi everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome to another Health Detective Q&A. Tonight I'm really excited, we've got Brendan Reid with us. So Brendan, thanks for coming along to answer all our questions.
You're very welcome. It's good to be here.
You've got a tremendous background in weight loss and a lifetime of struggles with weight loss, which is what so many other people have experienced. So we're really looking forward to tapping into your knowledge and your personal experience and what worked for you. And so thanks for coming along.
No worries. There was plenty that didn't work as well, by the way. That's why it took so long, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, well, I think that would be great to touch on as well. Just to start off, do you want to tell us a little bit, just a little summary of yourself, and have we talk about your book, because it's a great opportunity for people to learn about your book.
Sure. So my name is Brendan Reid. It was earlier this year that I released my book called The Fat Ginger Nerd, subtitled a weight loss story, and as it suggests, it's very much primarily the story of my own personal weight loss journey over the course of the first 40 or so years of my life. I'm in my early 40s now. Some people ask a few questions about the name of the book, The Fat Ginger Nerd. Isn't that sort of a bit on the nose or whatever? But it's no more controversial than any of the things that I was called over the years while I was growing up. In fact, those were the three things that people kind of tended to characterize me by: for my weight, for my hair color, for my introverted personality, shall we say. So it's just basically named after myself by way of the three things that other people tended to know me for. That's just the extent of that. It was published in February. The blurriness of the camera possibly prevents it from showing through. It took the better part of about 5 years or so to write, but it's hard to put a precise number on that process, because when I'd started writing, it was really just in the form of a personal journal that I'd kept to myself as I was starting to lose a meaningful amount of weight for the first time in my life. And something was telling me in the back of my mind that, if I don't sort of keep some kind of record of what's happening to me here, then I just might regret it, because, this was something that I never expected could possibly happen. I'd always wanted it to happen, but nothing had ever worked for me to that point. And so for this long-held dream of mine to finally appear to be becoming reality, I thought I've got to take some notes here as I'm going along. By the time I'd lost the weight and word was starting to get out, and people would say, "Oh, you should write a book about your story." And at first I thought, "Oh, no, books are for experts, people who know more than me, for your doctors, your professors, your journalists, people who know things." And I'm not one of those people at all. So, how does that work? But eventually I sort of put two and two together, and I realized, well, I've actually been writing to myself for a few years. And if I just keep going now with the idea of maybe something resembling a book down the track in mind, and fast forward to 2022, and
here we are. Yeah. And I think I've got questions coming in, but I think that, you might not be an expert in terms of having a background in nutrition or medicine, but a lot of what the experts advocate, and you'd spent your whole life seeing experts from childhood, and none of it worked. So I think, your own experiences are probably hugely valuable for people, because there's so many people out there in that same position.
Well, it's not a small market these days, is it? The numbers last time I looked, it's something like 66% of New Zealand adults are overweight or obese. That's basically 2/3 of us, right? And in other parts of the world, the US, it's something like 70%. So it is a story that I suspect will relate to a number of people in a number of ways.
And just a question from me before we kick off with all these questions that are coming in. A question for me is about fat shaming, because, you talk, the title of your book is a little bit contentious, as you say. And, we're stuck in this really difficult place between fat shaming, but between the problems of obesity and health and people being able to live up to their potential. Do you have, I'm sure you will have thought about this a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, I was fat shamed for years and years, like decades even. And when I think about it now, I kind of feel like a lot of it stems from this idea that a lot of us sort of, air quotes, know what people need to do in order to lose weight. Even children will just say, oh, you just need to stop eating so much and go running or whatever. It's become such common knowledge that we've kind of forgotten to maybe double check ourselves and say, well, is it really just that simple? Given that so many people are in this position, can so many people really across our entire society have spontaneously of their own accord decided to all become lazy, stupid, ignorant, all of those things at the same time? Over a matter of just a few decades. The chances of that seems really unlikely. I think if we ever reach a stage where we become more understanding as a society about what the real cause of weight gain to the point of obesity actually is, and that cause does turn out to be something that is perhaps contrary to some extent, at least, to what's commonly understood now, then maybe a lot of that fat shaming will just go away, because at that point, maybe there's a chance it'll become understood, it'll become accepted that, hey, sometimes it's beyond the person's control, that it's not just on them. It's not always their fault. It's an easy thing to do. You see someone, of a certain size walking down the street and you think, oh, what's their problem? What's with them? We all do it. We all judge people based on appearances as much as we all know we shouldn't, but it happens. And I've been on the wrong side of that for a long time. But what I have learned from my experience is that, there are things that work and there are things that don't work. And it's not to say that what is commonly understood to be the cause and solutions to obesity doesn't work at all for anybody. But what I can say with confidence is that standard advice most definitely did not work for me. And, as I was saying before, if there are so many others out there in that situation, taking into account the idea that really, when you think about it, nobody wants to look that way. Nobody wants to be fat unless you're training to be a sumo wrestler or something. Nobody wants to be that way. So there's a lot of desire out there. But juxtaposed almost with a lack of results. And it's an interesting sort of dilemma to ponder. But yeah, back to the fat shaming specifically, I think it's something that would solve itself if and when we get to a point where, as a society, we can really understand a bit more about what really goes on to cause obesity and weight gain in the first place.
And how did the fat shaming affect you emotionally? How did you, were you already this is a question, this is such a difficult topic, so it's hard to ask these questions sensitively, but how did you yourself personally feel about your weight? Were you fat shaming yourself as well during this period of time? Or did you have good self-confidence?
Not so much. I knew that I did not like the way I was. When I think back to my childhood, and as I imagine a lot of other people do when they think back to theirs, nothing is more important, or was more important to me at least, than just feeling like you're one of the crowd, like you belong, like you fit in. And kids, as kids always will, they will call people out for any given reason that may stand out on the part of others. And for me, I was an easy target to some extent because of my hair color, but most of all because of my weight. So I heard all the variations of fatty this and fatty that you can imagine. One of the most creative ones I remember that made me laugh was wide load. Like the signs that you see on the front and back of these oversized trucks on the road, that sort of thing. That one actually made me laugh. I never forgot that one. But most of them were not were not so humorous, and none of them really were meant kindly, obviously.
All right. Well, let's get into some of these questions. So, first question: are you an advocate for a low carb or a strict keto diet?
I am, for me, would be the short answer to that. I have, towards the end of the book, past the story, I write about how, since having lost the weight, I've spent a lot of time wondering, how is it that this low carb thing, which was what did work for me, how was this low carb thing not more widely known / understood / accepted than it currently is? And having looked at the science to the extent that I'm capable of understanding it with my feeble brain, it seems to me that it does feel like it's kind of underrated as an option. It's not something that necessarily stands out as the clear number one choice for literally everybody. We have to recognize and accept and celebrate the fact that people can lose weight in a variety of ways. But I've been scared off low carb myself for so long. I was familiar with it going back to the early 2000s. I remember hearing about it periodically in the news when it was doing the rounds as the Atkins diet. And every time it would pop up in the media, the experts at the time would always pop up in return and shout it down as being this crazy, dangerous, unsubstantiated fad diet. They love to use the word fad, I remember. And so me, wanting to do the responsible thing, to listen to the experts, be a good boy, do as you're told. That's what I did, because that's what I was told to do. So certainly I advocate for low carb on the basis that it worked for me, and certainly there is at least some evidence that it could work very well for a number of other people.
Do you, or did you fast, and do you suggest fasting for fat loss? Is that something that was part of your process?
So I didn't do much in the way of fasting, particularly in the early stages of my journey, because when I think back to the sorts of reasons why the more typical advice of just eating less and just cutting the calories regardless, why that advice tended to fail was the first thing that happened to me when I would stop eating is I would just get hungry. Hunger is physiologically the body's way of saying, hey, it's time to eat. Now, that the body may not quite have it right when it sends those messages for someone who's overweight, but the fact of the matter is those messages are incredibly powerful, and so one can't help but feel compelled to respond to that when you get that feeling. So it's kind of different to food addiction, which is kind of a separate thing. That's more like a compulsion to eat all the time. I didn't so much feel that. It was, for me, more just a case of responding to my hunger, because I was constantly hungry all the time. So for that reason, I wasn't really able to do much in the way of fasting, at least in the early months, because I still was feeling hungry all the time. And it was a very gradual process for me. It took about 4 or 5 months before I noticed that, I'm not snacking anymore. And I don't get quite so hungry at meal times anymore. It was a very gradual thing. It sort of faded away. The first standard meal, if you like, to disappear completely was breakfast. And lunch isn't much more than a snack most days for me, and dinner is my main meal these days. So whether you call that fasting or some extent of time restricted eating, perhaps, whatever the definition you might want to use, that's the extent of it I do now. I don't know that I could ever find myself capable of doing the extended multi-day fasts, because I can only guess it's just because my appetite has been so badly dysregulated for so long beforehand that there's only so far to which it will recover. My personal best, as far as how long have I gone without food that I can remember, was about 36 hours. And the only reason I was able to pull that off is because I was having surgery at the time. So I wasn't in a position to eat much anyway. I was fast asleep.
I think you make some really good points there. And, I know fasting and multi-day fasts are a big thing at the moment, but I think we have to look very carefully at who's doing them, why they're doing them, how long they're doing them for, and what the body's response is
they're very much a tool in the toolbox, right? So it's an option for some people who are looking to achieve certain goals. It may not necessarily be so suitable for others, but it's a tool in the toolbox. It's an option that can be looked at.
And do you feel that you had to become fat adapted before you were able to, you know, start skipping breakfast? And do you think that took a little bit longer, perhaps, for you?
I absolutely believe that it was the fat adaptation that
Yeah.
happened first, and it took me a while to adjust. But I wonder if perhaps because it took a while, I didn't really experience much in the way of symptoms. People talk about sort of the lightheadedness or the brain fog or the keto flu. The breath can be an issue for some people, etc. I had a little bit of it with the breath, but really not much more beyond that. My energy levels were fine throughout. And I can only speculate in my case that the reason I didn't really suffer too many symptoms is because I actually weaned myself into low carb quite gradually, in fact, in those first few weeks, because when I made a start on it, when I decided to commit to it, I didn't really have a true understanding of what low carb actually was. So I had to spend a lot of that initial time just learning what exactly should I be eating on low carb? What does it actually mean? What do my meals look like? Where do I go in the supermarket to find these things that I've never bought before? How do I then learn to prepare those meals that I've never learned to cook before? So there was a lot of learning, and I guess for that reason and in that context, the transition to fat adaptation was quite gradual, because I transitioned into the diet itself fairly gradually. But once I seemed to become accustomed, my body seemed to become accustomed to this new way of eating, as it was for me at the time. It just seemed more at ease with itself. And it took a few months for the appetite to then start to just sort of naturally fall away of its own accord. But that's what happened.
So it sounds like you didn't really allow yourself to get too hungry either when you first started. You made sure that you were fully fueled, and you didn't have that sort of conflict of, that calories in, calories out, whereas I can't eat, you were maintaining your energy in.
Absolutely right. In fact, it was the first of my 3 rules that I'd set for myself, and I decided I would do this, because I recognized that hunger was always the point of failure for anything I've tried in the past, just by cutting the calories. So okay, my rule number 1 here, if I'm going to do this, is I'm going to do it while never going hungry. And I honestly believed, when I set up this rule for myself, that I was surely going to set myself up for failure. Remembering that when I made the commitment to give this low carb thing a try, I wasn't actually convinced that it would even work. I only started it, truth be told, in order to prove somebody wrong. I thought, right, you tell me to do low carb, I'll show you, but I had to give it an honest go. So I thought, well, if low carb is the real deal, then, surely I can do it without going hungry, which is just this impossibly high bar that I'm sort of setting for low carb for myself in my own mind. And so I set up this rule number 1, just eat when you're hungry, don't when you're not. And it still worked in spite of what I thought at the time was a hurdle I was setting for myself. But if anything, it perhaps helped enable the journey, that it just took that stress and concern about that feeling of hunger just never being there anymore. Yeah.
And how quickly did you start to lose weight doing it in this way, Brendan? Because that's often a limiting factor for people. They feel like, oh, I haven't lost any weight, or I'm not losing it quickly enough.
Yep. And that sort of ties into the third of the 3 rules that I'd set for myself, which was to track my progress. So I know I can answer that question, and the short answer is it worked straight away. And it worked remarkably evenly throughout the course of the journey as well. There's a graph of my weight as I was tracking it over that period, sort of 2015 through to 2017. And some people would take a look at it. One person once described it as looking like the most fun part of a roller coaster ride. A lot of other graphs you see of other people, there are highs and lows as you go. There's a general trend, but it's a bit spiky as you work your way down. For me, it was a relatively smooth ride most of the way down. I started October 2015 at 132 kilos. And by New Year's Eve, the very end of 2016, 15 months later, I was down 50 kilos at 82 by the end of the following year. And as far as how much of that have I kept off ever since, it's been mostly that. There have been a few wobbles. There's been a bit of gain here and there for a couple of reasons. Things like just experimenting with different food options. Once I reach the goal, people have asked me at times, when are you going to start eating normally again? Oh, you've lost the weight, you can go back to eating what you were before, right? Well, I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't quiet these people up until I actually sort of indulged in a couple of things, and it was fairly easy to spot as soon as I would eat this, I would gain weight, that I would gain weight, and I would feel a bit hungry, and or I would feel a bit crook in the gut. It doesn't take long for you to figure out what works and doesn't work once you've got the bulk of the plan pretty much locked in place.
So what's your rule number 2? We've talked about rule 1 and 3. So what was rule number 2?
Right. So rule number 2 was in order to sort of help me understand what low carb actually was, I took the description of low carb very, very literally. I thought, well, this is obviously the foundation of the whole dietary approach. So I need to understand what it is about the foods by way of carbs. How do I identify what foods are low and not low? What's the cutoff point I sort of set for myself? And that led me to an exercise or a series of exercises by which I learned how to read food labels on the food products. I'd been recommended that I try and set for myself an upper limit of carbs by the labels on the product of no more than 5 grams of carbs per 100 grams of food. And at first I thought that sounds really, really restrictive, given that, some of the things I was eating to that point were north of 20 grams, 30 grams, 40 grams, for example, your trusty old bread, rice and pasta, these things that lived at the bottom of the eat most section of the healthy food pyramid that I've been diligently following for about 25 years to that point. I remember there was a jar of strawberry jam on my shelf, which was 65 grams of carbs per 100 grams, all of which was sugar. And so to think, oh, can I restrict myself to 5? That feels a bit too low, a bit too restrictive. I didn't want to scare myself away. So I went a little more liberal than that. I thought, right, let's go with a cutoff mark of 10. And so the first time I went supermarket shopping with that idea in mind, I'm stopping and looking at everything on the labels. I didn't want it to be so restrictive that I would die of boredom along the way. I didn't want to be eating the same meal every day. I wanted to learn. I wanted to build sufficient variety in the diet that I would be able to find some sense of enjoyment in it. I wouldn't get bored eating it and following it. And so I just sort of took the mentality of, right, set for myself an upper limit. Once I've established that upper limit, then I can say to myself, right, if it's under that line according to the label and it's low enough in carbs, I'm going to try it. I don't care what it is. I don't care if I might have tried it before. I've been introduced to it as part of some other meal in the past and decided, oh, yuck, I don't like that. I'm going to give everything a fresh look with the idea that it could help add to the variety of the diet. Because that's another common concern about low carb, right? Is, oh, it's restrictive. You don't want to be living off bacon and eggs every day. Well, no, I don't live off bacon and eggs every day. I'm not actually that much of a fan of bacon, which may shock a number of people. Nor was I really a fan of eggs, but I've learned how to live with eggs. I basically drown them in cheese until they don't taste like egg anymore. Was basically how I started to get used to eggs there. But I've backed off on the cheese a little bit more now. You'll be pleased to know.
So we have a question. What would you typically eat in a week? Have you got that? Is that in your book?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So that's in one of the appendices. If I have a flick through, so that's looks like it's Appendix A. Yes, here we go. So in Appendix A in the back of the book, page whatever this is, 260 something or thereabouts. I have a list of each of the individual items, basically like a master shopping list.
Right.
All of the various things, the meat, the eggs, the dairy, the fruit and veg. There is some fruit and veg, a few nuts and seeds, various other flavorings and condiments. There's various types of salt and stock and sauces, and vanilla extract is there, aioli and so on and so forth. So I have sort of my master shopping list there.
And I think you've got a shopping list with you, have you?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I have some props. Here's my here's my list of shopping lists, I suppose. I write them down every week in advance. Obviously, the lure of the camera is not going to reveal it. Do I even have this week's? Yes, I do. So I'm still working on it, but here's the pad with what I've written on it so far. Might be hard to read, but my shopping list thus far. So it's something I build up across the week rather than stress about it whenever I go shopping, which is on the weekends. So on my current shopping list, I have lamb chops, burger patties, cheese sticks, salami sticks, cream, although I might not need the cream. I might have enough actually now that I think about it. Let me go back to that one again. Salmon, tuna, protein bars, avocados. I usually get 6 avocados per week, but I'm only going to need 3 because I haven't had my full quota this week. So that'll be fine. I've got a courgette on the list and some salami. There may be a few other things as well, but obviously the list in the book has that much more. And beyond the master shopping list, I do have an example meal plan. So, you know, with that list, what sort of meals do I assemble with that list? There are 2 meal plans, one that I had for a while I was actively losing the weight, sort of about 2016, and another sort of version from about 2018 once I'd settled into maintenance. And what I eat now in 2022 is not really too much different from what's in the book there. Obviously, a couple of things disappear, they go out of fashion, they you know, brands of this, that, and the next thing they disappear, and other new things come along. So it's constantly evolving. But yeah, the master shopping list is there in the book, and there are a couple of meal plans in that appendix as well.
That's great. Does your doctor endorse your nutritional choices? How did you get on with your GP through this process?
I'd seen a few GPs. I've been in and out of a few doctor surgeries and indeed hospital emergency departments over the years. I've seen a variety of people, and the way they had regarded me sort of varied from person to person and from place to place. I think one of the silliest questions I ever got from a doctor was when he said to me, "Do you realize just how overweight you are?" And I'm thinking, really? Gosh, thanks for that, Captain Sherlock. Until you pointed out, it had never occurred to me. You know, nobody had ever pointed that out to me before at all. So yeah, that wasn't so great. I never went back to him again. But my current doctor, no, he's great. I had first sort of told him when I first met him, I had just been into the low carb for a couple of months at that point, so it was early days. So he'd taken over from his predecessor, and then he was going over my notes and you know, how are things? He's a bit concerned, and he might have gotten a bit surprised by the fact I'm great, I'm feeling happy, I'm excited, I've stumbled onto something that I think, you know, might be the beginnings of something really special. And he's sort of thinking, okay, well, we'll see how we go. I sort of wondered if he was a bit skeptical at the time, but you know, as I went back to him in the months that followed, I think he sort of came around. I think he sort of let his eyes you know, see for himself what was playing out in front of him, and he just sort of took it on board. Well, it's clearly working. There were question marks at one point about, I wonder what that's going to do to your cholesterol, but you know, that's something I've been monitoring on an annual basis with him ever since then, and you know, I've learned how to read a lipid panel to the extent that I need to. As well, and everything there is looking good. My triglycerides are nice and low, my HDL cholesterol is nice and high, my LDL floats a bit up and down, but it's you know, no big deal either way to me. Everything is pretty great at this point with my doctor and I.
And were you tracking other blood markers in the beginning as well? You know, did you have things, you know, fatty liver or kidney dysfunction or
so
pre-diabetes or?
Yes, so at first I didn't really track any of those things at all. It wasn't until about a year or so after I'd lost the weight that I actually had the idea to ask for a copy of my medical history, because I sort of got curious at that point. With all of the jabbings and pokings and proddings I'd had over the years, I wondered what sort of record there might be. Nobody had ever really told me to my face that there was anything wrong, besides the fact, oh, you're obviously just really fat. And again, you know, hello, thank you, Sherlock. But nobody had really told me any more than that. So at first, when I was still actively losing the weight, my sole focus was just the number on the scale. It was just about the appearance. It was just about how I looked. I hated the way I looked. I always had. You know, I carried facial hair for the better part of 2 decades for that very reason, of various sorts. The worst of it was this horrible, horrible neck beard. It retreated to a goatee at one point later on before it disappeared entirely. But yeah, it was something that I thought about after I'd lost the weight, and since then I have been paying more attention to more of those measures. I've never been diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic, but at the same time, as far as I can tell, my A1C was never checked before I went low carb either. It's not on my record. Right. So the closest clue that I might have in that direction is that I had a blood glucose. I had a blood glucose reading, I think, of about 6, which is, I think, borderline pre-diabetic.
And triglycerides? Did you have early triglycerides? Early
triglycerides was about 1, so it was, you know, it wasn't extreme or anything. It was, and the HDL was about the same. None of that really stood out. Probably the thing that stands out to me about my past blood work at this point, with what I know now, would actually be my C-reactive protein, which is a marker of chronic inflammation. And my CRP number, like for those who know, any number sort of above about 5 or so is sort of cause for questioning. You want it to be the lower the better, right? My CRP at one stage was 170.
Whoa.
And you know, a lot of people will have high inflammation because they're battling some you know, illness, some infectious disease. And I wasn't sick in that sense, but I was clearly chronically inflamed. It was, you know, a chronic metabolic disease, and 170, a CRP of 170 is really, really super high. Since I've been low carb, that's sort of floated around the 1-2 mark ever since. So that's been resolved. My triglycerides tend to float around the 0.6 mark now. Right. So they're down by more than a third. My HDL is more than doubled. It's well over 2 now. So there's a good ratio there. A1C is stable ever since I've been tracking it at about in the low 30s by the MML measure, which is about 5.1% for those who measure it that way. So all of those numbers, at least for as long as I've been tracking them since I've been on low carb, are spot on.
And so that brings me to another question, because there was, you know, what was the driving factor for Brendan to make better choices for his health? So I guess you didn't really know about the CRP, but did you have, you know, did you feel unwell? We can tie that in with another question, which was a bit about brain fog. What was that? It was about, you know, are you mentally sharper being carb free?
So that kind of separate questions in my mind. The brain fog is probably an easier one to answer. I will say that it obviously wasn't a goal of mine, at least not a primary goal. It was simply just to lose the weight, to look better, and just to feel normal, whatever that might mean for me. It was so hard to set goals because I'd been overweight my entire life, so I had no idea really what I was capable of even becoming. So that was a tricky one, but I did notice sort of towards the end of my journey, without really having gone to any great trouble to strive for it, was that my endurance, if you like, my mental endurance, my capacity for thinking for extended periods of time seemed to improve. I was able to concentrate for much longer at work. I stopped taking morning and afternoon tea breaks at work for the first reason, just because I wasn't hungry anymore, so I didn't need to stop. But then I realized actually I've still got the mental energy to just keep working through. So I haven't taken a morning or afternoon tea break now at work for 4 or 5 years, because I just don't need to. I can just keep soldiering on. So it's a subtle difference in terms of what I can do with my brain now, but it is something I have noticed. What was the other question? Sorry, I don't recall.
The other question was about what were the driving factors for Brendan to make better choices for his health?
Right. So I think it's important to understand in this case that this was something that I had always wanted to do. I had never wanted to be overweight. I hated the way I looked. I hated the sorts of attention that was being drawn to me. I would have done anything that anybody had told me to do, and that's in fact largely what I had done. You know, I've been sold on the food pyramid since childhood, did my best to follow it for many years. None of it ever worked. The desire had always been there. And it kind of, it speaks to a point that I sometimes think about around what people need in order to lose weight from a kind of a perspective of attitude, if you like. So it's not just a matter of attitude. There's more to it than that. But first of all, they need to be willing. Okay, people need to be willing to lose weight, and I was always willing. That was never a problem, as much as others might dispute it. People would say, I'm weak, I have no willpower, I need to try harder, I need to really commit and find some strength somewhere. You know, I was lacking in willpower. I was always willing, but the other half of the equation is you've got to be able. You've got to be both willing and able. And, you know, coming back to what we were saying before about the fat shaming and so on, people are so quick to assume that people who are overweight are just unwilling to lose that weight, when chances are maybe they're just unable. Chances are they'll be aware of their problem, and chances are they'll have done their best to do something about it, but maybe they just haven't been able to make that advice work, which, when you look at it from that perspective, immediately separates that idea of blame and responsibility on the person, because what they're being asked to do, as was the case for me, simply did not work. And it's kind of a strange irony to me that the one thing that finally actually did work for me was the very thing that all of the experts had been shouting from the rooftops for years every time Atkins came up in the news. It was the one thing that all these people were constantly telling me precisely not to do. So the desire was always there. I just was not physiologically able to respond as expected to that standard advice.
Yeah, to that, to the food pyramid advice.
Yeah.
Interesting. Hi, Brendan and Sue. Interested in your thoughts on how we should be feeding our kids. School lunches are hard too. Food that doesn't need to be kept cold tend to be carbs and or packaged rubbish.
So I'd like to make the point here that I am not, I have certificates in health and nutrition coaching, but I haven't put them into professional practice. I'm obviously not a dietitian or a nutritionist, and I don't see myself necessarily heading in that direction. So I just want to make that disclaimer. But in terms of what kids could, should be eating, etc., it's important to remember that kids are a little bit different from adults, in that adults are fully grown and that children are still growing, and children need, in order to grow, they need to be eating, they need the food. For me to be told as a 12-year-old to cut the calories, and I'm trying to live off cottage cheese and crackers and water for weeks at a time, it doesn't work. It just makes me weak, tired, hungry. I stop growing, whatever. You know, the trick with kids is that they still need to grow up, but we just don't want them to be growing out. And that's the trick with kids. So there is that added dimension because they are still growing. In terms of school lunches and things, the things I remember I was eating were sandwiches. Certainly during the time of the diet, it was sandwiches without butter, because butter's the worst kind of fat, don't you know? That was the message of the day. Marge was everywhere. There would be nothing in the way of cold savoury treats. There was the occasional cold sausage in the lunchbox some days, for example, left over from the previous night's dinner. That went out the window. There was a little bit of fruit here and there, a couple of pieces of home baking. You know, those were your treats. Those were sort of seen somehow as being free passes. A cake here, a biscuit or two there, they were seen as just being okay. What kids could be eating today, it's a really hard thing to do, perhaps even more so nowadays, because the messaging that we see in schools now is kind of a continuation or extension of what we see in wider society. You know, childhood obesity is obviously a big issue. I kind of see myself as an accidental trendsetter in that regard. There weren't so many big kids around in my days as there are now. So clearly that's a growing issue. But what I would feed myself for lunch now, I kind of think what I might do is probably something similar along the lines of what I have for lunch these days, which more often than not is just a few sticks of salami and cheese, meat and dairy, those sorts of products. There are other sort of options as well. The hard-boiled egg, you know, you can make a Scotch egg out of it, surrounded with mince and cook it up that way. These your large Scotch egg. There are things you can prepare perhaps beforehand in much the same way as you might prepare them for dinner, for example, except you're having it for lunch instead. One of my go-tos, certainly in the early days of my journey, were bunless burgers, for example. So I'd buy burger patties from the supermarket, just cook them up on their own, wrap a bit of lettuce around them, add a bit of cheese, and put a couple of those into a plastic container, and that would be a lunch option for me while I was losing weight. Things of that nature. You're right that you know, the majority of the options are the carbs and or the packaged rubbish. I guess I would just fall back to the idea of you know, what can be prepped in much the same way as you could prep for a dinner, for example, that will keep for a half the day at least, if you were to do the prep that morning.
I was reading today that there's, you know, we have these school lunches and that they're getting mostly tossed because the kids are not eating them. One of the things I encourage my parents with is, if school lunches are an issue, focus on the food that you're doing at home. So make sure breakfast is really good and substantial and has adequate protein and fat, and then whatever carbs the child can tolerate, you know. And then the same with after school. And, you know, I think after school is a great time for those things like the Scotch eggs and things like that, or a burger patty and some lettuce. And then with the evening meal, and then at lunchtime, you know, it's not such a big drama.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Like when I was transitioning into my sort of new way of eating, it was something that I sort of tackled, as I mentioned, very gradually. And some meal times were quicker to evolve than others for those sorts of reasons. So, you know, the dinners and the breakfasts were the first thing to change, exactly as you describe, because, you know, they were at home. Lunch took a bit longer to evolve for me because I'd be lunching with my friends and they'd want to go out and get some pizza or some fried rice or whatever. So I focused on what was easiest for me to change. I was master of my own domain at home. My house is my castle. You know, nothing within these four walls shall pass thine lips unless the carb content is sufficiently low, etc. It was really straightforward. So yeah, that's a fair point. If it's not the easiest angle to approach, then don't make it the first one. We can work on what you can have easier control over, and then maybe take it from there.
And I think it gives you the opportunity to experiment with different flavors and tastes and textures for children at home as well. So you can see what they enjoy, and then once they learn to like it and enjoy it, then that can get added into the school lunchbox, not as a, oh, yuck, what's that? That's different, but just as part of, oh, well, that's part of what we eat in our family.
Yeah, it's just a normal thing. It's just part of the course.
Yeah.
I remember it was an interesting time for me, you know, learning to try all these different things and learning how to cook all of these different things. You know, some experiments worked out better than others. My first attempt at mashing cauliflower was probably not too far removed from the sort of end result you were possibly reading about with some of those school lunches where the spud didn't quite turn out quite so well. My cauli was pretty rubbish. But, you know, you work at it, you get better at it. There are other things that I just couldn't bring myself to enjoy or incorporate at all. I just didn't like the taste of them. I've never been able to figure out a way to incorporate olives into the diet, for example. So I just don't eat them, even if by the numbers they will be ideal. But then there are things like macadamia nuts, probably the biggest surprise. I instantly fell in love with macadamia nuts. And I know that nuts can be a bit of a trigger food for some people. They are quite, calorific, particularly high in fat. So it is something that some people do have to be careful with, myself included. But they were a nice surprise, because my whole life I've been taught not to eat nuts for that very reason, because they're high fat, but not so much of a big deal anymore, because of the reduction in the carbs. You've got to get your energy from somewhere.
Yeah, and especially for children, macadamia nuts or little small packs of nuts are probably a great option as a treat to a bag of chippies or something like that.
True.
But it's about teaching kids to learn to enjoy them, and then once they enjoy them, then I think it's easier to feed them. Then another question was, what's the best protein to eat and why? Is fish best for omega-3 oils or capsules? Better for measured dose? Limit red meat? ?
Okay, so there's a few bits there, and I'll try and unpack them, each of them, if I can remember them all. So in terms of protein, I'm a fan of complete sources of protein, which by and large means your sources coming from animals, coming from meat. It is possible to get the protein that we need on a plant-based diet, but it tends to come with more calories, because there's certain amounts of protein in your plant-based foods, your veggies and other things, but it's not necessarily all as easily absorbable and able to be utilized by the body. It's not so, what's the word, bioavailable as a lot of the animal products. It means that in order to get the same amount of protein, you actually have to eat more total calories, if you like, if you're going plant-based. Again, not to say it can't be done, but it becomes a bit of a hurdle, because it's not the calories don't count at all. I certainly do agree that they are still a factor. They're just not the only factor. So when it comes to protein, I'm all for meat personally, both the red and the white. So the fish I'm fine with, the salmon obviously. Really good source of omega-3s, the DHA, the EPA. Again, omega-3s are not all created equal. There are different individual omega-3 fatty acids, and again, some of them are more useful and bioavailable for humans than others. Chia seeds are a good example of something that on paper has lots of omega-3, but not a lot of that can be easily taken up by the body, for example. Though there are other benefits of chia seeds as well, of course, high fiber and so on and so forth. So when it comes to protein, and it's something that I personally have been paying more attention to in more recent years, as I get used to just naturally eating less. Protein is not something we want to be skimping on, especially not as we age. So I feel that in more recent years, it has sort of become an increasingly higher protein style of low carb. In the beginning, it was more of a ketogenic approach, very much low carb, high fat. But the protein I just feel like it's starting to trend its way upwards as I sort of look to the future.
Well, I think it's that balance between energy. So the energy comes from our carbs and fat, and then the nutrients, which really come from our proteins. So we've got the amino acids and then, all those vitamins and minerals. Not to say we don't get some of them from our carbs and fats, of course. But yes, and I think that's a transition sometimes people don't always make. They start with a keto diet, which works really well when they have a lot of weight to lose. But as you lose the weight, the amount of fat that you need to eat needs to come down proportionately. And so then the percentage of protein needs to be higher.
Yeah. Remembering that the goal of weight loss is not just to lose any kind of weight. It's fat loss. It's fat that we want to burn. And once the body has reached a point where it is fat adapted and recognizes, okay, I can do this. I can recognize and work with fat as an energy source, which it's not able to do really until the insulin levels are low enough to really permit that, which is why we cut the carbs in the first place, of course. once the body is fat adapted, then exactly right. You just want to enable that process to be taking place. I remember thinking about it as a child. You know, when people would tell me I just needed to stop eating, it was that kind of dream scenario where I could just stop eating and my body would magically sort of eat itself, if you like. It would just live off itself and consume itself, and I would just shrink and it wouldn't be a problem. But of course, the hunger was always getting in the way, and that was the question I put on the back of the book, because it was such a prominent one when I was growing up. Why do I still get hungry when I'm already fat? But yeah, once you're fat adapted, then for sure you can look to dial back the fat that you're eating a little bit, because that's the goal, right? Is to consume the fat that's already on board to the extent that you can.
And then that brings us to another question about protein. So there's so many different points of view about protein, and protein being insulinogenic, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but you know,
I'm not a full-on expert compared to other names I could cite, but to my understanding, yes, protein can produce an insulin response, but we have to also remember that the reasons that protein produces that insulin response are for the right reasons. Protein is needed to, you know, repair tissue and to help build muscle and all of those things. And in order for those processes to take out, that requires growth at the cellular level, and that's what insulin helps facilitate. What we don't want is when insulin is raised to a point where it drives energy accumulation and storage and retention of that energy, rather than energy being put into use. I think it was Ben Bickman who gave a really insightful presentation at a conference a few years back about the insulin to glucagon ratio, and the combination of nutrients that were the most insulinogenic was carbs and protein, and the least was actually nothing, fasting. You know, you don't get an insulin response if you're not eating anything at all, but it was fat or fat and protein. But at the same time, you don't want your insulin to be so low all the time that you're not getting the right kind of growth, because it's more than, you know, weight loss is more than just about the number on the scales as well. It's about improving the body composition. You want to be building up the muscle. For that, we need the complete sources of protein, and you know, for that we will get something of an insulin response in turn. But it's the reasons why we get the insulin response coming from protein. I would feel that's okay. It's not that all insulin is bad. There are better responses, and there are worse responses, and I think that depends on where those nutrients are coming from and which nutrients are driving it.
And we need to remember, of course, that the body still needs glucose. So we don't need to consume our glucose through food, but our body still needs to be able to make glucose. And
that's true.
And so gluconeogenesis is one of the ways that we do that. And then as a response to gluconeogenesis, making glucose in the body, which we do from those amino acids, we are going to have an insulin response. And just as you said, Brendan, it's important. We don't want no insulin. We just insulin just cruising along nicely, but we don't want this chronically high insulin that's creating insulin resistance.
Exactly. We don't want it to be chronically high. That's your insulin resistance. We don't want it to be zero either, because that's type 1 diabetes. But it just needs to be managed. It needs to be kept at the right level for what it is that you're trying to achieve. I don't know if you're aware of this, or correct me if I'm wrong, but I also understand that the ketones themselves do actually provide a mild insulin response themselves, which helps prevent, under healthy circumstances, ketones from spiraling out of control, because they will produce their own insulin response, a very mild one, but just enough to keep those ketone levels from getting too high and reaching up and towards ketoacidosis territory.
Yeah, which is really important, because that's why type 1 diabetics go into ketoacidosis, because they don't have the insulin response to keep the ketones under control. So.
Exactly.
And just as the other part of that question, which was about the omega-3s capsules and things, as more research is coming out about that, looking for food sources of those is really important. And if you're going to take a supplement, cod liver oil is a very, very good supplement, but you need to make sure that you're not taking one that has added vitamin D in it. And that's a topic for another day. But taking extra supplemental vitamin D isn't isn't necessarily advisable. So cod liver oil has excellent levels. Pure cod liver oil has excellent levels of EPA and DHA, and also of vitamin D and vitamin A in the right balance that our body can use together, so that we're not blocking the receptors of one or the other by taking a poorly absorbed supplemental form. So that could be something to look into in terms of getting those omega-3s into the body.
Possibly. I sort of take the general viewpoint that where possible, as you mentioned before, we want to get as much of the nutrients from foods as they exist in their natural form, the unprocessed stuff versus the processed stuff, or the pills, etc. So I'm not that familiar with the supplement options, simply because I've tried to do my best not to indulge in too many of them myself. The only supplement I take for myself is magnesium. And that's for an issue that actually persisted long before I went low carb. I would occasionally get muscle cramps in my legs and all that sort of thing, even while growing up, and it was just written off as growing pains, whatever that meant. But they were really, really painful, and I still have them every now and then on low carb, but I've learned enough through over the course of my journey to understand that magnesium can, and in my case certainly does, help with the occasional leg cramp at night or whatever. But that's the only supplement that I've taken.
And the other things with the cramping on low carb can be potassium and sodium. So having all the electrolytes in proper balance can be really important.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get, sodium through your salt and potassium through various nutrition.
The shelf in my kitchen behind me to the side has about, I don't know how many, 4 or 5 different varieties of salt. I feel like such a salt snob. At this point in my life, it was the standard, iodized table salt, and that was all I had for years, and I hardly went anywhere near it, because salt was also right at the top of that healthy food pyramid in that eat least section. And now I have, the table salt. I have the low sodium salt that has, I think, potassium in it instead. I've got the Himalayan salt. I've got the beef and chicken stocks, which are quite salty as well, obviously. So I feel quite snobby on the subject of salt now, but they all have their own flavors. They all work for different things and different meals, as I've learned. So be it.
Just talking about supplemental options, though, there are food sources of supplemental options. So that's why I mentioned the cod liver oil. Mm-hmm. And then there are also organ supplements. So if you're not keen on eating organ meats, you can get really good organ supplements. And bee pollen, for anyone who's a vegetarian or a vegan, bee pollen can be a really good supplement as well if you're not getting some of these nutrients in your diet. So I'll just throw that out there for people. And if anyone wants to know brands or sources, we have some good sources in New Zealand, so just send me an email or a text and I'll flick you some information about that. Sugar. Getting off sugar. Is sugar as evil as YouTubers tell us?
Depending on the YouTuber. I mean, you might have YouTubers arguing that it's not evil at all. But I would take the side of it probably is. There's a lot of evidence mounting up, and a lot of evidence indeed that was put together some years ago. Some of it was actually suppressed back in the day, or they took their time publishing it or whatever, and it's only just starting to come to light more recently, all a bit controversial. But sugar was something that again, like the salt and like the fat, was always right at the top of the list on the healthy food pyramid, but nobody ever really talked about it in my day. It was, when I was growing up, sugar was really the only person who really took a stand against sugar was the school dental nurse. But aside from her, nobody really cared. It was just, it's just one of those things. You got to have a treat. If you're going to be naughty and have one of those things off the top of the food pyramid, sugar's got to be the least impactful, right? And I remember asking the dietitian that question myself as a youngster. Do I really have to be cutting all of these things out? I didn't want to upset the dental nurse, but I also, if the dietitian is telling me not to eat fat and salt's a problem as well, it feels like a lot to be cutting out. And when I put to her the question of if I had to choose to cut one thing out, fat or sugar, she said to me, fat is definitely your problem. You ever heard of that saying, you are what you eat? Yeah. So if you're fat, then that clearly means you've been eating too much fat. Fat is your problem. Fat is your number one target. Obviously, we know a lot better now. Sugar is becoming more widely known as a bit of a big old bad. Those of us with a little bit of biochem will understand the reasons why for that. There are reasons why the glucose component is not so good. That's, of course, what drives the insulin response. The fructose goes straight to the liver and meshes you up there, and then drives insulin resistance through separate mechanism entirely. Fructose, if anything, may be the source of the addiction sort of component to it, because that's where the sweetness comes from the fructose. There are all sorts of compounding reasons. I once summed it up to somebody I was helping one day as basically saying, trying to explain the difference between fructose and glucose. And I sort of tried to sum it up, and maybe it was an oversimplification, and by way of saying, fructose makes you sick, glucose makes you fat. And sugar has both of them. Mm-hmm. At least with the starchy carbs, the bread, the rice, the cereals, the pasta, and so on. That's all the glucose. But the sugar is the worst of both worlds. It's a double whammy. So yeah. Let's go with the idea that sugar I would consider to be fairly negative.
Well, my dad taught us to eat lettuce by sprinkling sugar inside it and rolling it up and eating the lettuce when we were kids. So it used to horrify my mother.
I could not imagine that.
It was actually quite tasty, yeah. Anyway, that was his little lettuce eating trick. Okay, better move on to some other topics. We're just about nearly there at the end of our hour. So what questions have I missed? I've missed a question about seed oils. Can you touch on what you do about seed oils, what your thoughts are about seed oils?
Yeah, so my thoughts on seed oils, they kind of evolved over the course of my journey as well. Remembering that I took a very literal approach with low carb. I thought, right, well, low carb is low carb, and it's typically high fat as a consequence, at least while you're getting underway. So I wasn't really bothered by the seed oils at all at first. It was just about getting rid of the carbs, lowering the insulin, just so that I could lose the weight, and I hadn't paid much attention to those seed oils. Obviously, since then, I've done a bit more reading and learning. I've read, books like The Big Fat Surprise and so on, and others. If you've seen another video by Chris Kenobi from Low Carb Denver 2020, had a really interesting video on the dangers of seed oils. I was actually there in the audience for that one, and yes, I was there that day, which is a pretty big day. But that video has since gotten quite a lot of attention, something like 1 million or so views since it was published. What I've learned, obviously, since the early days of my journey is that they have their own reasons to be avoided. Any sort of cooking oils, as they are heated, will oxidize, and that does all sorts of things. You get all sorts of nasty chemicals coming out of that as a consequence. And it seems, broadly speaking, that the more unsaturated those oils are, the worse off they are. There are some, like you have the difference between your monounsaturated fats, which are somewhat unsaturated. Then you have your polyunsaturated fat, poly meaning many or lots. So polyunsaturated is more unsaturated than your monos. So the polyunsaturateds I learned to switch off over time. more recently, I've begun to transition away from even using olive oil to cook. Not that olive oil is a problem necessarily when you're drizzling on a salad, for example, something like that, but it's the effect that the heating of these oils has when you're using them in cooking that really causes the problems with the aldehydes and the other chemicals that can come out of it and drive who knows what. So and this is something I've just sort of started to transition towards now is cooking with solid fats, whether that's dripping or butter. I've just bought some ghee the other day. In fact, my latest food experiment. Here's another one of my props. Some is that going to show? There we go. Some lamb fat, house-made lamb fat, locally rendered for a local butcher just down the bottom of the hill. So yeah, it's just various combinations of those solid fats that I use for cooking now. And if nothing else, beyond just the health benefits, or at least the avoidance of the seed oils by cooking in the solid fats, I've noticed, interestingly, that the solid fats cook far more quietly. They don't spit and sizzle and make a mess of your kitchen. Not so much cleaning required afterwards. So that's kind of a nice aside for a kitchen newbie like me, who's still sort of getting used to that whole environment in recent years. And
I've got a great interview. I did a good interview with Chris Kenobi, and I also did one with Tucker Goodridge. So there's two really good interviews out there, but there's lots of interviews with both of them on YouTube, so you can go and check those out for more information about the dangers of seed oils. Couple of comments. Love ghee. I make my own suet from beef kidney fat. Yeah, that's great.
Nice.
And then another question. What are the good fats you've covered that. Well, that was interesting. So that's good. The other question was, what happens to the loose skin after weight loss?
Yeah, so that depends on the person. It depends on a number of things. Obviously, how much weight they lose, obviously has a bearing on it. I had heard, although I don't have any data in front of me to demonstrate, that generally speaking, the skin tends to recover of its own accord a little bit more easily the younger you are. So when I'd lost my weight, I was sort of 38, 39 when I underwent the surgery, because I had enough of leftover sort of below the belly button for me. I could basically grab it like a flap with both hands and just sort of lift it up like this. Hello. And that was the extent of it for me. Obviously, there are some more extreme cases than that. I have also heard that an extent of fasting can help with that, with the breakdown of cells that the body doesn't need anymore, the autophagy, the apoptosis, the cleanup processes, etc. The prolonged fasting in some people I've heard can help with that. That doesn't apply to me, obviously, because I couldn't do that because I was just hungry, all the time at first. And while it's vastly improved now, I only eat twice a day now at most. I still feel the need to eat at least once every day. So the fasting component wasn't really so much an option for me in that regard. In terms of what happens with it, well, for me, I made the decision to get it removed. Although in saying that, I would have been just as happy to have learned to live with it. I figure, and how did I describe it when I was writing about this once? Living with a mostly deflated balloon out in front of me was so much better than living with a fully inflated one. It's a bit awkward to have to find a place for it when you're tucking things in or whatever, but at least you can tuck yourself in, which you can't do when you're starting off where I was. Everything's just exploding in every direction. Clothes shopping was a really tricky business for me before, and it still is now, but for totally opposite reasons, right? Previously, it was so hard for me to find things that would fit. Now it's so easy, it takes me all day. I'm not used to having so much freedom of choice, and I can get to decide what what styles of clothes do I like and not like, because I've never had that freedom of choice before. So I tell people, I've got no fashion sense whatsoever. And I mean it, because I haven't really had that lifetime's worth of trying to figure these decisions out for myself. So I'm still learning as I go, as far as the shopping is concerned, but I'm getting there.
Oh, well, this has been amazing, Brendan. I don't know if anyone's got any last questions. Please throw them in to the chat. I'll just remind everybody, Brendan, you and I did a podcast a while ago, and you talked about a lot of this and a lot more, so people can go and have a listen to that as well.
They can. Yep.
Which would be wonderful. And also, you told me that you were going to be speaking at the Pre-Cure conference. So
yeah.
you've heard it here first, okay? But this is an exclusive.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So on my own YouTube channel, I have a couple of talks of some short recordings of talks that I gave prior to COVID shutting everything down. I'm pleased to be able to say that I have another opportunity to get out and see the world a little bit again for the first time in a while. So Precure are putting on a conference called The Future of Medicine, running in November. I think the dates are the 17th through to the 19th, which is a Thursday through to Saturday. So a 2-point little bit day conference. The Thursday is just a bit of social stuff that evening, and the conference proper is the Friday and Saturday. And I've been invited to say a few words there, which is really exciting. So looking forward to that.
Oh, well, congratulations, and that'll be, I think that's great. Can you tell people where they can find your YouTube channel and where they can find you? And I'll put links to that. I'll put the Amazon link in the notes for your book.
Sure. So the website is just thefatgingernerd.com. Links to where to purchase the book, etc., are all on the website. It's available in ebook or paperback. It's a print by demand, which means there's no mass print distribution, so it's not so easy to find in bookstores outside of Dunedin. So it's mostly online orders only, unless you live where I live in Dunedin. I can make arrangements to get a few copies appearing on shelves here and there in a certain couple of local stores, for example. Other socials, I'm on Facebook under The Fat Ginger Nerd. Twitter is @FatGingerNerd. And if you were to search YouTube for my channel there, I think it's just called The Fat Ginger Nerd as well. A couple of videos there with links to other podcasts and interviews that I've done as well, such as the one that we did here not so long ago. Yeah.
And so thank you, Brendan, you're an inspiration. And thanks for coming along tonight for this Q&A. We really, really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Always lovely to talk to you.